I'm Still Here by Infinite Songbird on AO3. Chapter 10, The Trove. Now I believe you have something that belongs to me. For an awful moment, Keith could do little more than sit frozen in shock. All the self-assured conviction he possessed only moments earlier melted away, the sweet and short-lived taste of victory turning to bile in his mouth. What's wrong, little one? You didn't really think you'd win against the might of the Gora, did you? The cavern erupted into familiar jeers as torches were lit, washing the cave in firelight that bounced off the walls and illuminated the terrified, gagged faces of Keith's own crew. Even Lance and Ramel, who'd been right behind Keith mere seconds ago, were being forced to their knees, struggling against their captors with wide, desperate eyes as they were shoved to the ground beside Shiro and the Alteans. He'd barely gotten a good glimpse at the fresh bruise adorning his brother's eye before his face was being wrenched violently back to meet Zendex. They cannot help you now, boy, he hissed, his grip on Keith's chin one of steadfast iron. But play your cards right, and you might be able to help them. He's lying. The sound of Lance's voice surprised them both enough that Zendek's grasp on Keith's jaw slackened, allowing him the freedom to see that Lance had somehow managed to shimmy the gag down off his chin. Don't listen to a word he... Lance keeled over as Ren socked him hard enough in the stomach before yanking the gag back over his mouth with a maniacal grin. Vision awash with red rage, Keith had just opened his mouth to deliver Marina an empty threat when Zendek stepped toward Lance, obscuring him from Keith's view. Well, little blue, I must say I'm disappointed. Leave him alone. Keith lunged towards the pirate captain, efforts thwarted as he was reeled back and pinned to a wide chest. Keep still if you know what's good for you. Ross's voice growled by his ear, but Keith paid him no attention, far too focused on Zendek's cybernetic hand as it reached to grasp Lance's chin between forefinger and thumb. Although Roth's grip around his arms was bruising, Keith still struggled to worm his way out of the pirate's hold. Get off me, he snapped, and then raising his voice for Zendek to hear. Don't fucking touch him. He hadn't exactly expected Zendek to listen, but his stomach rolled nonetheless as he watched the Galwar captain stroke a thumb along Lance's jaw. What'd your family have said, I wonder? Blue and green glared up at him, bright and resilient in the reflection of the flames. 5 years of loyal servitude for their sake, gone in an instant. How pathetically weak-willed you humans are. They would have told him he was brave, Keith said, continuing to buck against Roth as if that might imbue his words with even more bite. They'd have been proud. Lance's eyes met his own, his eyebrows furrowed in a wordless thank you, but the moment was promptly shattered by Zendek's laughter. A sweet sentiment, he mocked, but I'm afraid that your family is no longer of any concern to you. If the pirate captain had expected to break Lance, to watch him crumble into a mess of tears and grief, Keith suspected that he must have been sorely disappointed by the set of Lance's jaw, the challenging tilt of his chin. Pain torched his eyes, but there was something else there, some seed of assuredness and resilience born from something that Keith could not truly name, shining through the tears that spilled down his cheeks and glinted in the torchlight. Apparently, Zendek saw it too, that burning something in Lance's expression. Whatever it was had the Galwar captain leaning down to tug roughly at the gag over Lance's mouth. Something to see, Scout? Lance leveled Zendek with a look deadly enough to raise every hair on Keith's arms. One of these days, he croaked, voice low and raspy, the foreboding whisper of leaves against the ground as they ushered in the winds of winter. I'll kill you myself, Zendek laughed. Is that a threat, boy? Lance shook his head, just once, the movement as final as if he were issuing a death sentence. It's a promise. For a moment, oppressive silence hung over the cavern, like fog, thick with tension and hatred, and then Zendek chuckled. Strong words for one with so much left to lose. Fear finally crept into Lance's eyes as Zendek rolled back on Keith, drawing a wicked long knife from his belt and crossing over to him almost leisurely, the buckles on his boots rattling with each step. Wait! No sooner had Lance gasped the word than he was sliced once more by the gag, nearly choking on it as he locked eyes with Keith and yelled something incomprehensible. The thud of footsteps came to a halt, and Keith grunted as he was once again yanked to meet that glowing cybernetic eye. I think we both know, Zendek growled, knife glinting in the firelight as he brandished it overhead, that this has been a long time coming, boy. Unable to scrounge up even a single word from the buzz of angry thoughts clouding his mind, Keith's lip curled as he reeled back and spat as hard as he could into the Gaur's face. Zendek cursed and jerked backwards, and Keith had only a second to celebrate his minuscule victory before searing hot pain exploded across the right side of his face like fire. He wasn't sure whether or not the pained cry that echoed across the cavern belonged to him, though when the black finally receded from his vision, he found himself braced against the floor with both palms and panting as spots danced across his eyes. When Zendek spoke again, his voice sounded shrouded by static, as if he were communicating through one of the old space radios Keith's father used to own. "Let that be a lesson to you, little Blue, and to any of you who wish to play the hero. Bravery will only yield to bloodshed. No." The worn, cracked leather of 2 boots filled Keith's swimming vision, and he flinched at the sound of Zendek's voice right above him. "Search him." Keith was jerked upwards, the sudden motion making his head spin, and though he was relatively unfamiliar with the face suddenly hovering inches from his own, the eyes hadn't changed. "I trusted you," he whispered hoarsely, squeezing his right eye shut with the pinprick of hot tears. When the pinprick of hot tears drove the pain in his face to levels unbearable. "Please don't do this." For a moment, Thorne simply held his gaze, her expression inscrutable and impenetrable as always. And then she was patting him down, reaching at long last into his pocket and extracting the golden orb that Keith and his crew had worked so hard to keep from this very fate. "No." Keith struggled weakly as she held the map up to the firelight, examining it in a large palm. "Thorne!" "Finally," Zendek interrupted, tossing Keith aside as he stalked toward her. Discarded, Keith fell weakly to the floor, hissing in pain when his palms met unforgiving stone. "After years of searching, years of hiding in the shadows, it is mine." Thorne offered it to him without a word, and Keith's heart sank as he watched Zendek's purple claws close around it. "The riches of Zarkon's trove at my fingertips, at long last." Zendek's crew cheered, their revelry a crushing weight that drove any remaining hope to the pit of Keith's stomach. It pinned him to a spot on the floor, rendering him helpless and immobile, weak beneath his own monumental failure. A hush fell over the cavern as Zendek turned his attention to the map, eyeing the round digits that adorned the orb before proceeding with his task. His crew watched him work with bated breath, as if even a sigh might break the captain's concentration. But as Zendek's muttering grew increasingly frustrated, and the map remained resolutely shut, the cavern slowly came alive with murmured conversation. And in the midst of it all, Keith laughed. He knew he probably shouldn't have. His face was on fire, and he couldn't quite open his right eye. But still, something about the image of the fearsome Gaur captain struggling to open the tiny orb felt like a tiny victory. It was a snide laugh, one that earned him a swift and enthusiastic kick to the stomach that had him hunched and coughing before he was being hoisted by the lapels of his coat. "Something funny, boy?" Zendek hissed, far angrier than Keith had ever seen him. But he couldn't bring himself to care, not when Lance and Shura were somewhere near, gagged and frightened and braced for death. "I was scared of you," Keith slurred, trying desperately to think through the fog of pain that consumed him. "Fuck off." Zendek's responding growl was a low, terrifying thing, the rumble of a predator that was done playing with its food. "Your arrogance will be your downfall. Why don't you see how brave you are when I decorate the walls with your brother's blood?" Despite himself, Keith swallowed, all at once out of words and out of will. Seeming to notice the light extinguishing behind Keith's eyes, Zendek's lip curled before he was dropping Keith back to the floor and shoving the map in his face. "Open it." Wordlessly, Keith took it, using what little fight he had to send the hulking Galra a venomous glare whilst his fingers navigated the map, dexterously prodding and pulling and twisting until the cave was awash with blue light, surprising and striking enough that several of the Galra were forced to shield their eyes from the sudden glow. Planets danced around them as nebulas twinkled out of nothingness, stars sparkling to life in the oppressive dark. As usual, the display rendered Keith nearly breathless, and a glance around the room proved that he wasn't the only one. Even Zendek, severe and cruel as he was, stared slack-jawed as his cosmos swirled around him. A whole lifetime of work. Finally. With a silent apology to his crew for any potential repercussions, Keith slammed the map shut, drowning the cavern once more in a dark that felt far blacker than it had been before. You're taking us with you. The protests of Zendek's crew were swiftly silenced by a flourish of their captain's hand, the movement as deadly as if he'd drawn a sword. What are you playing at, boy? Steeling his courage, Keith swallowed, aware that his crew's lives hinged on his next words. I'm the only one who knows how to open it. You need me, and I'm not doing shit without them. Need you? Zendek snarled, a cue for Marina to draw her knife across Lance's throat, pressing hard enough to draw blood. Blue and green eyes squeezed shut, and Keith's stomach lurched with dread. You overestimate your power, human. You will show me how to open this map, or you will suffer my wrath. He has a point, you know. Every head in the cave whipped toward the chipper voice to find that Ramel had somehow slipped her gag down to her chin and was now beaming around at them as all as if they were long-lost friends. You can't do it without him. You. The pirate captain took a step closer to her, eyes narrowing, and thought, I know you. In response, Ramel smiled pleasantly up at him. I know you. You were Zarkon's lead engineer. I was, she agreed. You built the map. Ramel's eyes twinkled. But of course! I won't deny it was a tricky task. Zarkon was adamant about his fail-safes, and combining Golrotech and Altean quintessence was... What fail-safes? Zendek interrupted, impatience turning his voice to a low growl. Well, the Altean cocked her head as if trying to remember. Zarkon wanted to ensure that whoever opened the map was a worthy heir, as well as Agora, of course, so he rigged it to sync to the biosignatures of the first person to crack the code, provided that they had Gora blood. Keith's blood ran cold, frost spreading through his veins. No, it couldn't be. It was a must. Through the ringing in his ears, Keith was distantly cognizant that Ramel was still talking, completely unaware that she'd sent his entire world crumbling at his feet. The micro-readers wouldn't react unless... Stop. A slow smile, wicked and foul, had dawned across Zendek's face as he turned, undoubtedly having realized the enormity of the truth behind Ramel's words. Well... His footsteps were amplified in the hush of the cavern as he stepped slowly over to Keith, who scrambled back as dread crept into the pit of his stomach. That explains it. Explains what? Keith bit, fear and unease turning him defensive. He couldn't be. He refused to believe. Without warning, Zendek was in his face, crowding him against the ground as he ducked closer and drew in a breath. You're sent. He chuckled as he drew back, rising to his feet once more. It eludes me no longer. Not quite human. Not quite us. An abomination, he hissed, eyes glittering with simultaneous contempt and glee. Vermin. I'm not. Keith's heart thundered away in his chest as he saw Lance, who watched him a few feet away with furrowed brows. I can't be, he pleaded, unsure who he was trying to convince. His gaze turned almost frantically to Shiro, whose eyes were as wide with surprise. Dad is... human, yes. Zendek sounded as if he were enjoying the punchline to the world's suckiest joke. But your mother? You never knew her, did you? For the first time since their capture, Keith was completely lost for words, sick to his stomach with dread and wishing more than ever for his father. Zendek laughed again, his eyes flickering between Keith's as he watched him unravel. She was a disgrace, to lie with a species so weak, so fragile, pathetic. It's no wonder she left. Keith's voice broke. She didn't. I'd wager she couldn't even face the shame. She was a coward. Sparks of warm memory danced across Keith's mind, each marred and tainted by the horror of this new revelation. Soured were the memories of late-night conversations beneath the stars, curled up against his father as he recounted stories of Keith's mother, sweet anecdotes of their time spent falling for one another. She loved you, his father had always said, his voice so tortured that Keith had never had the heart to ask what happened to her, to ask how she must have died to warrant that level of pain. You were her whole world. The words used to make Keith ache, both with love and loss, but now they made him nothing but sick. Seemingly satisfied, Zendek waved Thorn forward, keeping his eyes resolutely trained on Keith. Separate the boys' crew for the night, he instructed. We leave at first light. Thorn's brows furrowed. Do you mean for them to accompany us to the trove, Captain? I do. Zendek's smile turned saccharine. Death would be too kind, Lieutenant. The boy will lead us to the trove come morning. He may take the night to contemplate his... As Zenda cocked his head, one of his sharp canines glinted in the firelight. Heritage. And his crew? Perhaps we shall need the extra hands. And perhaps they may keep those hands, provided the boy remains in line. Aye, Captain. Thorn turned to the cavern at large, surveying each of the pirates' faces as she addressed them. You all heard your captain. Prepare our camp. We'll move at dawn. The responding commotion had Keith flinching against the floor, and he hardly had a moment's recovery before someone was hitting the ground beside him with a pained grunt. Fuck you, Ren. You didn't have to throw me. The emergence of Lance's voice at his side was enough motivation to send Keith propping himself up on a shaky arm, crawling towards him with an urgent need to be held. Lance. And get him some salve, or he's not going to be able to fucking see in the morning, Lance called after her retreating form. Let alone Lance. It was Lance who closed the distance between them, urgent hands flying over Keith's hair and hovering around his marred face before settling out for his shoulder. Oh, Keith, I got you, sweetheart. Keith swallowed around the knot in his throat, hands rising to touch every inch of Lance that he could reach, shoulders, neck, face, his touch desperate and searching as his boyfriend pulled him closer. Are you okay? Am I okay? Lance's voice broke, his hand reaching to cup the good side of Keith's face. Keith, please, Lance, I'm okay. Doting fingers brushed through Keith's hair, and Lance's voice grew hushed and soothing. I'm okay. Good. Something about the way Lance was looking at him rendered Keith unable to maintain eye contact. He squeezed his eyes shut as he leaned into Lance's touch, the feeling of Lance's palm against his cheek the only thing viscerally grounding him to reality and sanity. She was a coward. Tears pricked at Keith's eyes. I didn't know, he uttered hoarsely, his heart a lump of coal in the pit of his stomach. Dad never... I know. The gentleness of Lance's tone drew Keith's eyes back to him, even as staunchly determined as Keith had been to avoid that gaze. How are you okay with this? He asked, taking a shuddering breath as he searched Lance's eyes. I'm Gulra. You... Half Gulra, Lance corrected, brushing a thumb over Keith's cheekbone. And even if you were full, I wouldn't fucking care. You're nothing like them. Overcome with love, Keith mirrored Lance, bringing trembling fingers up to graze against lightly freckled cheeks. But what if my mom was It doesn't matter. I know you're hurting, and you have every right. But this doesn't change who you are, Keith. You're still... Lance's lips quirked into a small smile, shy and vulnerable and sweet. You're still the guy I fell in love with. Something fervent and warm reignited in Keith's chest, some shred of resilience that had become lost to the oppressive dark. When Lance's smile deepened, bathing Keith in familiarity and adore, Keith was once again struck by the thought that if they ever got out of this, he wouldn't mind seeing that smile for the rest of his life. You told me once, Lance continued, combing Keith's hair behind his ear, his voice steady and assured, that nothing would ever change the way you felt about me. Remember that? When Keith nodded, Lance trailed his hand down to the side of Keith's arm till it found his hand, lifting it slowly to his lips and planting a tender kiss to his palm, a far more intimate and meaningful kiss than any they'd shared. Nothing is ever going to change the way I feel about you. His dimpled grin was the first dapple of rays of light piercing the clouds after a thunderstorm. You're not getting rid of me that easy, doll. I'm in this for the long haul. Keith laughed, an ugly, wet thing that brought on a fresh wave of searing pain. But through it all, Lance's hands were steady in his, an unshakable anchor keeping him tethered to hope. Thank you, he whispered, longing to kiss him. Lance's eyes crinkled at the corners as he nudged his nose against Keith. Don't mention it. And for the record, I don't know why she left, but your mom missed out. Big time. I don't need her. Keith's voice was firm, even to his own ears. He cradled Lance's face between his hands, sure in that moment that he'd die before he'd let any harm come to him. I don't need some deadbeat mom to make me feel whole, Lance. All I need is... Something fell between them with a thwack, bouncing off their laps and smacking onto the wet floor. The two of them startled, breaking away to find Thorn hovering over them with a neutral expression. The medicine you requested. I would apply it quickly if you'd like to save his eye. No shit, Lance snapped, all traces of the warmth gone from his voice and face as he reached for the packet. That's fucking genius, Thorn, thanks. Feeling brave, Keith met her eyes, channeling as much cold hatred as he could muster into his expression. I can't believe I thought you were different, he growled, In front of him, Lance struggled to tear the packet of medicine open, but Keith kept his eyes resolutely trained on his former mentor. You're just as much of a monster as the rest of them. Thorne's eyes flashed dangerously in the low light, yet her stony expression revealed nothing. It is as I told you when we met, she hissed, turning to walk away, but directing the last words smoothly over her shoulder. You can never be too careful. Any attempt at a retort was stilled on Keith's tongue as Lance touched his hand, drawing his focus back to kind eyes. Ignore her. It's just me and you, okay? Let's get you patched up. One other glance proved that Thorne had returned to Zendik's side, the two murmuring together in low voices as they surveyed the shadowy figures settling in for the night. Keith swallowed. He and Karan are somewhere by the entrance with Roth. Lance hurried, as if reading Keith's mind, and I think I saw Rave take Laura and Ramel further back, like, way behind us. Cosmo's somewhere back there, too. He grunted, gritting his teeth as he struggled with the pack in his hands until it finally tore. With a relieved sigh, he dipped a couple of fingers into the salve before regarding Keith with his crease in his brow. This is gonna hurt. If Keith had thought he was prepared for the pain, he was sorely mistaken. The first graze of Lance's fingers against his cheek burned, ice cold and excruciating. It was all he could do to keep his mouth shut, his clenched teeth barring any cry of pain from escaping. I know, Lance whispered, and it was only when his boyfriend spoke that Keith even realized he'd squeezed his eyes shut. I'm sorry. Keith wasn't sure how long they'd sat like that, Lance meticulously applying salve and Keith immobilized by pain. But eventually, the agonizing burn dulled to a numb throb, and Lance was pulling away as he wiped leftover salve against his pants. Okay, he muttered, giving Keith's face one more scrutinizing look before nodding. Hold on. Now hope he heals up okay. How bad is it? He'd refrained from asking, too scared to actually hear the answer, but now the question slipped out, tentative and nervous. Lance huffed fondly, his eyes going gentle and sad as he tucked Keith's hair behind his right ear again. It's gonna leave a mark, that's for sure. When Keith gave a reluctant laugh, Lance leaned forward to kiss his cheek. I won't lie to you, it's intense, but when it's all healed up, you're still gonna be as handsome as ever. Keith blinked. It really wasn't the time for this, nor was it the place, but you think I'm handsome? To a surprise that pulled a real laugh out of Lance, one that had run hissing at them for silence from her spot next to Zendik and Thorne a few yards away. Well, duh, Lance grunted, lowering himself to sit next to Keith and pressing their shoulders together. It was really hard to hate you when you were so fucking pretty. So are you, Keith swallowed, feeling particularly stupid when Lance looked at him. Thought so since the moment we met. Yeah? Stars above. Keith didn't even have to look at him. He could practically feel that shit-eating grin burning into his face. That why you couldn't take your eyes off me that day? Yeah, Keith confessed, part of him surprised at himself for doing so. The other part was tired and scared and sought sweetness like an ointment for his wounded heart. Thought you had the most beautiful eyes I'd ever seen. He'd been expecting more gentle teasing, but instead Lance's head fell against his shoulder. After a small pause, he murmured, I used to hate them when I was younger, you know? Really? Lance nuzzled against him, making himself more comfortable as he settled in. Oh yeah, you know how it goes. Kids are mean and shit, but one day Mom comes back from the market and she's blown like 2 months savings on that little marble just because it reminded her of me. I liked him a lot better after that. Keith huffed against Lance's hair as realization dawned on him. So that marble is the only thing I left to her, yeah. Or my whole family, really. Zendik didn't exactly let me pack. I just left with my clothes on my back and whatever happened to be in my pocket. Ignoring the jolt of pain along his face, Keith turned his head, angling himself to press a kiss to Lance's hair. Is it safe? Yup. Lance patted his pant pocket, speech beginning to slur with fatigue. Always. Good. Keith kissed him again, wrapping an arm around his shoulder as he lowered them both slowly to the floor. Catching on, Lance followed suit, snuggling up against his chest the moment Keith's back hit the hard ground. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, both exhausted to the bone. What are we gonna do, Keith? With a long inhale, Keith pulled him closer, heart aching when Lance's arm wound around his chest. I don't know, but we're gonna figure it out together. Together, he giggled, a quiet, sleepy thing. Never been in love before. Feels nice. Yeah. Keith's heart swelled with affection as he brushed Lance's hair from his forehead. It does. When Lance mumbled something unintelligible in response, Keith found his gaze straying into the firelight where Thorn and Zendik still sat conspiring, and something in Keith snapped back to life, blazing fiercely away in his chest. "I'm getting you out of this alive," he promised the boy in his arms, the thought making him feel invulnerable. "And I'm bringing you home." He woke in the morning to a swift and unpleasant kick to the side, courtesy of Roth, who grinned wickedly down at him. "Up you get, navigator. You've got a long day ahead of you." Before Keith could tell Roth to fuck off, Lance grumbled against his chest and shifted sleepily until he'd managed to throw the pirate a lewd gesture. When Keith snickered, Roth's lips curled, and Keith prepared for another kick as he drew his foot back in. "Roth!" Thorn's voice cut clear and sharp across the cavern, jerking Roth immediately to attention. The captain's return from scouting. "Cease this foolishness and attend to him at once." With a low growl, Roth wrenched himself away, striding towards the entrance of the cavern without so much as another word to Thorn, who watched the boys from a distance with her piercing gaze. "You two, up," she commanded. "I recommend you take special care not to anger the captain. I don't think I need to remind you." Her voice was icy as her gaze found Keith's. "That your crew's lives hang on a thread." "We get it." Lance propped himself up, hair mussed up on one side from a night spent sleeping against Keith's chest. "Doom and gloom, yeah, we're up." Keith waited for a reprimand, but none came. Instead, Thorn merely narrowed her eyes before turning, weaving through the busy chaos of her crew and out of the cave. "How do you think she and Zendik fit through the tunnel?" Half of Lance's words were obscured by a yawn as he stretched, coaxing several alarming cracks out of his back. "You'd think they'd use their nanotech to shrink or something? Imagine how Tom Zendik would look if he was like a foot tall." Despite the urgency of the moment, Keith could feel a smile creep onto his face as he regarded the man he loved, disheveled and exhausted, but a spitfire nonetheless. As if it had a mind of its own, Keith's hand extended toward him, fingers tangling in Lance's hair and palms settling against his cheek. "Hi." The sunshine grin he received in return made something in his stomach flutter. "Hi," Lance greeted, his eyes going soft. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Keith admitted, finding that the searing pain in the right side of his face had settled into a dull ache. "How's it look?" "Better," Lance echoed, shifting forward onto his knees and taking Keith's face gently into his hands. "It's healing up pretty nicely, actually." He was so close that Keith had only to lean forward ever so slightly to kiss him, pulling him in by the waist as he tried wordlessly to thank him for his companionship and his strength, but most of all for his love. They were separating long before either of them wanted to, eyes closed as they pressed their foreheads together. "We should stop," Lance breathed, tilting his chin up enough to kiss the tip of Keith's nose as his fingertips grazed the right side of his face, careful to avoid his healing wound. "I don't want to hurt you." "I'm fine," Keith reiterated, surprised by how much he meant it. It was as if the events of the previous night had made him stronger somehow. The ache in his face, the constant reminder that he'd survived, that he was still alive. "And I'm going to get us out of this." Lance pulled away with something that looked like resigned defeat in his eyes. "Keith." "No." Rocking back onto his heels, Keith pushed himself to his feet, dusting his hands against his pants before offering them to Lance. Around them, pirates milled about as they readied for the day's excursion. But all that mattered to Keith in that moment was the boy at his feet. "I need you with me," he urged, his voice hushed yet full of conviction. "I know you're scared, but this isn't going to work if you give up. We're a team, Lance, remember?" The two of them fell silent as one of the Galra passed close enough to make them nervous. As soon as he was out of earshot, Lance sighed, eyeing Keith's extended hand. "We don't have a plan." "I know, but you trust me, right?" Green and blue eyes searched his own as resolve hardened behind them, and with an air of finality, Lance placed both his hands on Keith's upturned palms, allowing himself to be tugged to his feet. "With all my heart." They made their way out of the cavern together, hands connected as they weaved through pirates and ignored the sneers and smug remarks thrown their way. It was only after they'd squeezed out of the rock crevice and into the open daylight that they were truly separated. Lance yanked away from him and ushered off to stand beside Shiro, who shot him a helpless, furtive glance. Keith, on the other hand, was practically thrown in front of Zendik, nearly spraining his wrist for what felt like the upteenth time as he caught himself on the jungle floor. "Good morning, Red," Zendik rumbled, seconds before a clawed hand was closing around his jaw and yanking him to his feet. "You've healed well." Name's Keith, he bit, trying and failing to wrench his head from the pirate's grip. The rest of Zendik's crew tittered, and the captain's mouth stretched into a grin that showcased every one of his sharp teeth. There's that goal of fire, he hissed, giving Keith's head a little shake before letting him go. You'll make a worthy addition to our crew. Rage bubbled up in Keith's throat, red, hot, and uncontainable. It built within him, a pressure that rose and rose until he snarled. The sound was so animal, so distinctly Galra, that Keith's anger dissipated almost instantly, scuttling back down his throat, and his eyes widened in surprise. Well! Sendak thumped him on the back, and the rest of the pirate crew exploded into laughter. Keith cast an embarrassed glance over his shoulder, longing to find his brother's eyes. He was only able to catch a glimpse of furrowed, worried brows and a shock of white hair before Zendik had laid a hand on his shoulder. I'm glad to see you're finding your true voice, Little Red. It feels powerful, doesn't it? Lost for words, Keith could do little more than gape up at Zendik as he tried to recover his wits. There was no way that sound had come from... No. Disregarding Keith's blatant mental turmoil, Zendik reached into a pocket, withdrawing the map with one hand and grabbing Keith's wrist with the other. You have a job to do, halfling, he sneered, shoving the map into Keith's hands. Halfling. The word was somehow enough to jumpstart Keith's stalled motor, bringing the world back into focus as hatred pulsed through his veins. You're not gonna win, Keith silently promised, glaring up at the hulking Galra as muscle memory guided his fingers once more over the map. Piece of shit. The orb burst open with more vigor than it normally did, as if it could sense that the trove was near. But this time, instead of revealing a map, a beam of blue light shot off into the distance, piercing through the foliage and beyond. It appears, Sendik muttered, resting a hand on Keith's shoulder as the two of them gazed after the beacon in awe. We have finally found our course. Good work, Little Red. Turning back to his crew, Zendik withdrew his curved saber, slicing it through the air in an arc as he gestured in the direction of the blue beam. After that light, quickly now. Glory and riches awaits. For the next several hours they walked, following the beam over rough terrain and through thick jungle and stopping for nothing save for the occasional animal attack, which Keith learned very quickly not to fear. Zendik was an unstoppable force, close enough to his life's goal that nothing stood a chance at the fierce swing of his blade. Keith wondered how soon it might be before he, too, felt its wrath. As the hours continued to multiply, he could almost feel the pirate's mounting frustration, could hear the restless murmurs and the slackening footfalls of the crew behind him. More than once, Zendik was forced to turn and command a quicker pace, an order usually met by fearful wide eyes and frantic apologies. Behind them all, bringing up the rear of their party, was Keith's crew, where Keith had been honored with a position up front at Zendik's side, hands free to hold up the map. His crew had gotten the rotten end of the deal, their wrists tied together with thick twine as they were tugged along at an inhuman pace. Sweat soaked through their clothes and dampened their hair as they struggled forward on shaky legs, exhaustion evident in the slump of their bodies and the gradual decrease of their speed. Traits that did not appear to be present in Keith. He wasn't sure how long they'd walked, but it was only when Lance stumbled out of exhaustion, Keith nearly blew a gasket when Roth tugged him roughly up to his feet, that Keith realized he simply wasn't tired. He knew that he should be, knew that he'd slept restlessly and that the past couple of days had been the most rigorous days of his entire life. But as his crew faltered behind him, Keith found himself matching Zendik's persistent stride without fail. It was as if the previous night's truth had unlocked something within him and multiplied it tenfold. Some part of him that he'd never quite gotten to examine. The part that had always been faster and stronger and more agile than his fellow peers. That allowed him to pull Lance from the gaping maw of the black hole, a feat no human should have been able to accomplish. But then again, he wasn't human. The evidence was layered atop memory after memory, reaching all the way back to his childhood and so ingrained in his being that he wondered how he hadn't seen it sooner, how he hadn't questioned it sooner. He wondered if Shiro had known, or suspected, or if their father had ever told him, if maybe this was just another secret of many that he'd kept from him. Most of all, he found his thoughts straying to his mother, who she was and why she left. He thought about her in the past, sure, but he'd always assumed she'd passed away or that she'd left his father over some irreconcilable issue. now he wasn't so sure. His mother had been Galra, which wouldn't exactly have boded well for her relationship with his father. As much as Keith would have liked to deny it, he couldn't help but feel sorry for the two of them. It wasn't if Galra were exactly welcome throughout the galaxy, regardless of pirate status or not, but Keith, well, in his heart, Keith was pretty sure his father hadn't fallen for some pirate. Despite the lies and despite the secrets, Owen Kagane was a good man. Keith had always known that. His father had been his entire world for as long as he could remember, someone whose kindness and compassion he would never cease to idolize. Whoever his mother had been, she'd been someone worthy of Owen Kagane's love. Of that, Keith was certain. He was so lost in thought of her that he nearly walked into Zendik's back when the pirate stopped, rammered straight and exuding tension as he stared dead ahead. When Keith followed his gaze, his heart dropped into the pit of his stomach. Ahead of them was an enormous cliff face, sheer, unscalable rock stretching up from what seemed like miles. It would have been a breathtaking sight if not for the insistent pulse of the blue beam against the impenetrable rock. For a second, the only sound was that of ragged breathing, and then, "Is this some sort of trick, boy?" Zendik's lips were curled in anger, his hand clenched around the hilt of his sword. Heart racing, Keith eyed it nervously before turning back to the map, looking frantically between it and the rock wall, as if either one might turn sentient and give him answers. "No, I don't know, maybe there's something behind it?" The pirate captain's eyes burned. "Something behind the mountain? That's gotta be the only Then you've led us to a dead end." Anger boiled up Keith's throat, and then again he snarled, the sound just as unfamiliar as it had been a few hours ago, but strangely emboldening. "You saw the same thing I did. It was a straight path all the way here. We probably just have to go around the..." With a sickening little blip and a whir of gears, the map in his hand closed, taking with it not only the beam, but Keith's last hope for his crew's survival. "Fuck," he whispered, scrambling after a breathless second to poke at the indents that would no longer depress, almost as if the map had locked itself. Behind him, Zendik bellowed in a wordless rage before grabbing Keith by his jacket and hoisting him up into the air. He kicked, valiantly attempting to hold on to the map as he grunted with effort. "Just let me..." "Even though you still think you're in a position to use leverage? I didn't do this." One of Keith's kicking feet collided with Zendik's shin, which prompted an angry roar. "It's just closed by itself. I don't know what's..." "Then you better figure it out, vermin." Zendik seethed as he tossed Keith to the ground and unsheathed his sword, pointing it towards the group of gagged prisoners at the rear of their party. Lest your crew lose their heads." Behind them, the pirates clamored in angry agreement, and Keith's heart raced out of options and out of time. Head spinning, he pushed himself to his knees, eyes darting frantically to meet his brothers, and lances, and then allures and crayons, finding nothing but the same bittersweet resignation in all their faces. "No, I can do this," he yelled from his spot on the floor, unsure who exactly he was trying to persuade. His trembling fingers rounded the map, pressing and twisting in vain as the orb refused to open. "Why the fuck won't it..." "Captain, if I may..." Keith's attention was ripped away from the map and towards Marina, who had parted with a throng of pirates and an antsy-looking Cosmo who was slithering forward with a look of burning contempt on her face. Every ounce of hatred in her eyes turned on Keith. "The boy clearly lies." "Fuck off," Keith bit, turning back to the task at hand. He jabbed angrily, desperately at each of the map's digits. "I just need a fucking second." "So, you do not know how to handle the device?" I do, Then why won't it open? Then why isn't it open?" Her voice was low, a dangerous hiss. "He deceives us, Captain. My Captain. Surely you can see." "And what," Zendik growled, rage simmering beneath his words, "do you propose I do about it, Marina?" Her eyes flashed with a wicked light. "Kill him where he stands." The jungle seemed to still, birdsong falling quiet and wind dying in the trees, as if the very planet itself awaited Zendik's verdict. Keith's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his hands against the metal ball clutched tightly between them. And then, no. Eyes shutting in relief, Keith released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, even as Marina hissed angrily, "Captain, I'll not repeat myself, Marina. The boy may may prove to be a valuable asset, and he and Blue shall make fine slaves. What about the rest of them, then? With a sweep of her clawed hand, she gestured toward Keith's crew, who, despite being gagged, somehow managed to look a lot braver than Keith felt. Why not kill them? They are a danger, Captain. They're no use to us dead. The human may yield information about the galaxy garrison if we prove persuasive enough, he purred, tapping the hilt of his sword. And the Alteans have yet to answer for their crimes against our people. But this isn't a discussion, snake, Zendik snapped. I suggest you get back in line and remember your place. I could do it myself. There was something strangely desperate in Marina's voice, something so cruel and animalistic that it had Keith shuddering, edging away from her until his knee dipped in an indent in the ground, small and circular and hard like cement. What was... You wouldn't need to lift a finger, Captain. Our biggest liability taken care of. As Keith brushed soil and tree fall aside, fingers scrabbling to uncover whatever it was that his knee had hit, he watched from his peripherals as Zendik took a step towards Marina. You wished to free us from liability? Of course, Captain. Keith knew it was going to happen a split second before it did, his attention momentarily diverted from his digging to the flash of Zendik's sword and the cry of terror, and then the remains of Marina, severed at the neck, falling to the jungle floor with a muted thump. Would anyone else like to question my judgment? Zendik roared as Keith pawed desperately at the soil, suddenly terrified of what the pirate captain might do if he didn't deliver. He wasn't even sure what exactly he was digging for, but it felt too smooth and carved to just be a natural divot in the rock. With trembling hands, Keith finally brushed away the last of the dirt, shock rendering him momentarily hesitant as he ran his fingers over a depression in the ground, the exact size and shape of the orb, etched with patterns that were an exact match for those on the map in his hands. And you... Keith was distantly aware that Zendik was talking to him now, though he could barely focus over his own rapid-fire heartbeat. You'd best figure this out, or... The pirate captain never got to finish the threat. Keith practically plunged the map into the divot, scrambling backwards when the sphere pulsed and sent lines of blue light running across the jungle floor and up the cliff face. Up and up the lines traveled, glowing brighter as they multiplied, the initial lines breaking into more until they formed a dense network, a pulsing blue that lit the whole cliff. And then Keith was no longer staring at a cliff. The rock wall vanished as if it had never been there, an illusion likely contrived from the very same Altean magic that created the map. Where moments earlier there had been sheer rock, there lay before them now the gaping maw of an enormous cavern, the hollowed inside of a great mountain, and within it, a hand landed on Keith's shoulder. Well, I'll be... Zendik murmured, awed and greed alike creeping into his voice as he took the rolling hills of gold and coin and glittering gems, stretching on for what seemed like miles. You really don't disappoint, do you, boy? As Keith rose to his feet, wholly lost for words at the sight before him, and unable to form even a single thought, Zendik chuckled and bent, snatching the map from the divot and pocketing it before turning back to his crew. You lot, he ordered, but Keith had no idea who he was talking to, too captivated and dumbstruck by the enormity of the trove and the volume of Zarkon's loot. Remain out here with the prisoners, the rest of you with me. Bring the scientist. She may be useful. Someone shouted an affirmative, and Zendik's hand tightened around Keith's shoulder. And bring Blue, he added, the command enough to finally draw Keith's attention. I'd like to keep a close eye on our dear cabin boys, he rumbled, giving Keith's shoulder a painful squeeze. I trust he'll be on your best behavior. Wait, clarity was beginning to dawn on Keith, the fog that settled over his mind at the sight of the trove finally clearing as his stomach churned. You want us to go in? But of course, little Red, the captain purred, his voice sending chills down Keith's spine. You belong to me now, after all. Any possible response was lost as something hit Keith's shoulder, and he turned to find that Lance had been shoved toward him, wrist untied, but gag still in place. With a malicious smile, Zendik reached out to tug it down. You won't give me any trouble, will you, Blue? Lance remained silent, glaring at Zendik with an expression that Keith had never seen him wear before. Apparently Zendek had, because a smile left his face almost as quickly as it had come. I don't need to be reminded that you still have much left to lose, boy. I don't need to remind you that you still have a lot left to lose, boy. Keith could practically feel Lance's body tense as he drew in a breath to speak, no doubt to say something reckless and angry that Keith might have normally applauded, but now Keith found himself snaking his hand into his boyfriend's, sending him a subtle shake of his head as soon as their eyes met. The burning rage behind blue and green dulled into something softer, yet no less passionate, and Lance squeezed his hand in response. We'll comply, Keith conceded, trying his best to look resigned and broken even as his mind scrambled through a plan. Just, please don't hurt our friends. Of course, Red, Zendek responded. One corner of the pirate's mouth crept up into a smile, and Keith got the sense that he wasn't the only one lying through his teeth. You have my word. When Keith nodded, Zendek grinned, turning his attention to the rest of his crew. Let's move. No sooner had he given the order than Keith was being thrusted forward by a sharp prod at his back, and though he'd never been in this sort of situation before, Keith could damn well guess what the press of a blaster against his lower spine felt like. He'd taken a couple of steps when someone else collided with his shoulder, and he turned to find Ramel beaming pleasantly at him, freed from her bindings and gag. Oh, hello, Keith, she greeted, not waiting for a response before craning her head to look at it around him. Hi, Lance. Hi, Keith answered as Lance sighed. Hey, Ramel. From Keith's left. Exciting, isn't it? Ramel asked, eyes glittering with awe. Zarkon's trove. As if someone had flicked a switch, her palpable joy turned suddenly to what looked like apprehension. Do either of you feel like you're forgetting something? She asked, cocking her head at the two of them as their party neared the entrance. My fucking sanity, maybe, Lance muttered darkly, even as Keith cast a glance behind him, catching only a glimpse of white hair and familiar brown eyes that he longed to say goodbye to, before he was being jabbed roughly in the back. Eyes forward, the pirate behind him ordered gruffly, and Keith complied with a sigh, worry creeping anxiously up his throat at the thought of being separated from his brother. He had no time to dwell on Shira's safety, nor even on Lance's or Ramel's, as Zendek's hand reached out to grab him, fingers twisting around his shirt and pulling him right up to the mouth of the cave. What do you make of this, Red? For a moment, Keith wasn't sure what he was referring to, and then he blinked, suddenly aware of the faint shimmer of blue in his vision. A look around, Keith had to crane his neck at this angle, proved that the entire entrance was covered by it, a film so thin that Keith wasn't surprised that none of them had seen it till they'd gotten close. Looks like some sort of shield or something, Keith murmured, bringing a palm up to hover an inch away from the blue film. Even though he wasn't touching it, he could feel the way it pulsed with energy, as if it were a living organism. I think it might be Altean magic. All eyes turned to Ramel, whose Altean markings, soft blue and nestled at the crest of her cheekbone, had begun to glow. It helps to toggle the trove's disguise. Is it safe to pass through? Keith asked, not quite liking the way the magic pulsed under his hand, almost as if it were trying to keep them out. I suppose, came Zendek's slow voice. There's only one way to find out, Little Red. Keith hardly had a second to protest, much less even process Zendek's words before he was being shoved forward, vision distorting for a microsecond before. Holy shit, he whispered, almost too transfixed by the shift of gold coins beneath his boots to notice Zendek stepping through behind him, pushing him out of the way with one meaty hand as his giant feet sank slightly into the shifting treasure. The rest of the Galra pushed through the barrier and past Keith with hushed words of awe, every one of them captivated as they waded through the heaps of treasure with dreamy expressions in their faces. For his own part, Keith could hardly move, almost in a trance as he gazed at the incomprehensible expanse that laid before him. I can't believe this place actually exists. The sound of Lance's voice was enough to shake him from his reverie, and Keith turned to find him staring slack-jawed and at the glittering gems hanging like stalactites from the ceiling. 5 years, he continued, coming to rest at Keith's side, and I never thought we'd... Shit, we're actually here. Keith reached for his hand. You okay? Yeah, Lance's eyes snapped sharply towards the band of pirates, already a good distance away as they stumbled unrelentingly on. How are we going to do this, Keith? As if on cue, Roth bent down towards a pile of gems with an elated cry, withdrawing a large nugget of crystallized quintessence. You and I both know that if they get out of here with that shit, no one's going to be able to stop them, Lance whispered, angling his face towards Keith's ear as the two of them watched Zendek snatch the quintessence from Roth's hands. The captain hoisted it triumphantly into the air, sending the pirates scattering in all directions with orders to find more. Not us or the Galaxy Garrison or any army. And if they find that weapon, we're fucked. Keith finished, eyes darting around the trove as he searched for answers. No kidding. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound being various exclamations as the pirates drew further and further away. Zendek will use that weapon to destroy everything. Not if we find it first. He turned to Lance with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, catching his other hand and giving them both a squeeze. We split up. I know you don't want to. He rushed as Lance opened his mouth to protest, but we'll cover more ground that way. Lance sighed, the sound so world-weary and lost that Keith found himself once again struck by the fact that he'd been lost to space for a long, long time. We don't even know what we're looking for, he groaned just as Keith's eyes strayed for Ramel, who was muttering pleasantly to herself as she ambled aimlessly a few feet away. No, he agreed, already tugging Lance along by the hand. But she does. Are you serious? Lance hissed as they approached her. The chick's got a few screws loose, Keith. That doesn't mean she won't remember. Plus, she mentioned it yesterday, Keith countered, hastily returning Ramel's wave as soon as she'd noticed them. Ramel, we were... Hi, Keith amended, practically vibrating out of his skin with impatience. Lance and I were wondering if you knew where Zarkon's weapon was, he whispered, throwing a glance over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being overheard, though most of the pirates were much too far away now for any real worry. If you can remember anything at all. Weapon? Ramel frowned, the expression unfamiliar on her face. You mean his ship? That was destroyed by the blade of Marmora, we know. Lance cut in, sounding about 10 times more impatient than Keith. But all the legends say he made some sort of lethal weapon out of quintessence and stored it here for safekeeping. You said yourself it took you weeks to build. Keith nodded vigorously, not quite liking the lack of recognition in Ramel's eyes. Right, and if Zendek finds it, he's going to hurt a lot of people. Me and Lance just need to find it first and make sure that doesn't happen. So, do you know where it is? The Altaian girl's nose scrunched up in thought, and for one hopeful second, it seemed as if she'd remembered something. But Keith's hopes were dashed a moment later. No. Great. Lance released Keith's hand to run both hands through his hair, causing it to stick up in every direction. Well, you've been zero help. Thanks for not... You have to know, Keith pressed, ignoring Lance in favor of reaching desperately for her shoulders. Please, we'd be looking for something big, a planet killer, or... If only I could remember, she lamented, hands twisting in her hair. I'm forgetting something. There's something important that I can't... Her breathing spiked, tears springing to the corners of her eyes. I just can't... Hey, it's okay, Keith reassured, even as Lance placed the gentle hand on his back with a quiet murmur for his name. Lance and I will find it. Can I help? She asked, dislodging a tear that she nodded. Keith winced. Keith winced and brushed it away as he searched for the right words. Look, he started, glancing at Lance briefly before returning to her searching gaze. You've been plenty of help, okay? Without you, Zendek would have killed us both last night. We just want to keep you safe. It was the kindest way he could think of. We really need you out of the way. But Ramel nodded again, and Keith gave her a smile. Think you could stay hidden for us? We'll come get you before we leave, I promise. We promise, Lance gently corrected. Ramel looked between them, undoubtedly deciding whether or not to trust them, and Keith couldn't help but feel relieved that she still had enough wherewithal to comprehend when she might be in danger. All right, she finally agreed, nodding resolutely. I won't let you down. Neither will we, Keith promised. Just stay by the entrance, okay? Keith. Lance's voice was a gentle murmur, kind yet urgent. We need to move. Right. Releasing their new Altaian friend, Keith stepped back to glance around the cavern, taking the stock of endless mounds of treasure and feeling far less confident than he had a few minutes ago. I go right, you go left? Sounds like a plan, Lance agreed. Okay, Keith muttered, already moving as he scoured the towering piles of gold ahead of him. I'll see you. Wait. He was tugged back to Lance by a hand around his wrist and immediately pulled into a kiss, short yet lingering. Stay close, okay? If something happens. Keith pulled him in by the back of the neck for another almost bruising kiss, this one possessing a ferocity that the last one had not. I will, he murmured, and then he was on his way, turning from Lance before he could lose his nerve and setting off toward his towering heaps of treasure. It didn't take him long to realize that he was completely and utterly out of his depth. Surrounded by monotonous stacks that reached high above his head, Keith was losing faith by the second. The cavern had to have been several miles long, and there was no telling how far down it went, or rather, how high the treasure was stacked. He weaved through the piles almost aimlessly, struck by the sinking feeling that the weapon could be buried several feet below him, and he'd never know. His only cause for hope, it seemed, was that the pirates hadn't found it. Every glimpse he managed to catch of them through the stacks proved that they were still searching, each one digging through gemstones and loading quintessence into burlap sacks. He had just resigned himself to regrouping with Lance, hopeful that his partner had been luckier than he, when his mouth was covered without warning, an arm snaking around his torso and lifting him into the air. Heart suddenly racing, Keith struggled against his unseen assailant, pounding his fist against the purple arm until he was being shoved against a mound of gold, staring into a pair of eyes that he once trusted with his life. I'll let go of you, Thorne began, hands still placed firmly against Keith's mouth, if you promise not to scream. Unable to do much more than glare at her, Keith rolled his eyes before tapping a finger against her hand. When it fell away, Keith could feel his upper lip curl. The fuck are you doing? We need to leave, now. Keith blinked. Of all the things he'd been expecting, that wasn't something he'd been prepared to hear. What? Thorne growled, though it sounded like as if it were more of frustration than anger. I don't have time to explain. We just need to leave now, Keith. Like hell we do. Keith snarled as he attempted to shove the mountain of a woman away from him. I'm not going anywhere with you. If Zendik wants me to... Abruptly, Thorne gripped him by the shoulders, baring her teeth in sudden anger as she pushed him against the wall. I'm not... Something sad passed through her eyes, and her grip slackened. With Zendik, she continued, her voice growing gentler. I never have been. Disoriented, Keith shook his head, wanting desperately to believe her, but after the galley, is this some kind of trick? For a second, Keith watched hesitation flicker behind her eyes, which were far more expressive in that moment than he'd ever seen them. And then resolve was hardening behind them as she sighed. Look, she whispered, craning her neck briefly around the mountain of gold before returning her attention to Keith. I'm a member of the Blade of Marmora. I've been undercover at Zendik's side for years. She plowed on as if Keith's brain wasn't melting by the second. I was tasked with finding and destroying Zarkon's trove. Keith felt as if he were adrift in an open space, nothing around to tether himself to for miles and miles. But I don't have time for this, she interrupted, desperation creeping into her voice. This whole place is rigged to blow. I laid the bombs myself. She dug through her pocket until she procured a black device with a blinking red light, a detonator. The plan was to always grab you and run and set it off the moment we'd reach safety. But when I was laying the last one, I found a network of explosive rigs beneath the gold. When Keith didn't reply, caught somewhere on the edge of panic and skepticism, Thorne shook him. Keith, there's enough firepower in here to destroy the planet. Zarkon must have rigged it to blow the second we stepped through that shield. It was a motion detector, Keith whispered, stomach sinking with dread. Exactly. Searching her eyes and finding nothing but open truth, he was hit again by a sudden rage, a sudden fear that this was all just another trap, another scheme designed to hurt, to trick. And why the fuck should I believe you? For all I know, this is just another game. Keith, we don't have... You lied to me before, he reasoned, standing his ground, even as she pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes, losing her composure in a way he'd never seen as she snarled in frustration. Ah, you were just as headstrong as your father. The gears in Keith's head came to a screeching halt, the fight leaving his body and rendering him meek and vulnerable. Several seconds ticked by, silent and eternal, before Keith finally found his voice. What? He watched as Thorne hesitated, her eyes flickering back and forth between his. For a moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity. She sighed and shut them. "That wasn't how I wanted to tell you," she whispered as she began to shrink, her whole body shifting forms for a second time since he'd known her. Large ears retained their point as they shortened, arms and legs growing less bulky and facial features turning sharp and angular. Even her skin had adopted a lighter shade of lavender, and before long Keith was once again staring at a stranger that was almost his spitting image. "I wish I had more time," she continued, reaching toward Keith's face with trembling fingers and honesty shining in her eyes. "There's so much I've wanted to..." Her fingers curled and withdrew, and Keith wasn't sure whether he wanted to feel them on his cheeks, or whether he wanted to run, or his voice broke. "Hermione," she nodded, searching between his eyes with urgency and a vulnerability that crippled him. "My name is Corlia Lavos Kagane. I know I've given you no reason to trust me, Keith, and when this is all over, I promise we'll talk, but right now..." The cavern rumbled incessantly enough that Keith might have thought it to be a quake, if not for the conviction shining in Corlia's, his mother's eyes. "We need to go."